Hi everyone, and welcome again. I'm going to be your host for this track. Uh, Today we start with Pavel. Is that right? Did I say your name correctly?
Yeah, just perfectly fine.
Okay. We will be talking with us from, I think the discussion is going about the wheel angular move toward this component-oriented architecture or not, right? Architecture. Or
Yes. You will have ears full of Angular and components and all the associated things.
Okay, I'm looking forward to see your talk. I just want to tell everyone that if you have questions, please leave your questions on Umbrella on the streaming tab, and I will relay them to Pavel. So, Pavel, are you ready?
Absolutely.
Okay, so if you can please introduce yourself and start the presentation, the
Right.
stage is yours. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much for the introduction. So my name is Paweł Kozlowski. I will tell you a bit more about myself in a sec, but just more about the presentation. So you are stuck with me for the next 45 minutes, and we will mostly talk about the Angular framework and more importantly about the evolutions that we are planning in the next year. So if you happen to be Angular developer or hanging out in the Angular community, you probably heard about a project called Angular IB. And IB was just major rewrite of the rendering engine of the framework. So we kept the public API, we kept all the mental models, but we've swapped the internal implementation. So there were many reasons for this change of the implementation. We communicated a lot about the benefits. But for me, the most important part is that this rewrite opened up a lot of possibilities for further evolutions of the Angular. And this is the talk about what IB enables or what might change in an Angular in the future. And I just wanted to mention that title might be slightly provocative because what does it mean to move Angular to more component-oriented architecture, right? One could argue that Angular is already very much component-oriented. We write components every day. You compose applications from components, and so on. But in reality, the truth is a bit more nuanced. So I would like to talk about those nuances and kind of pave the path toward the future where components are really the first-class citizens. So before diving into the nitty and gritty details, just to introduce myself, I'm working for Amadeus. I'm based on the south of France. So Amadeus is this company that does a lot of software for the travel industry, and we've wrapped this software into beautiful and functional UI. So we do a lot of UIs in Amadeus. We've got lots of UI developers doing many different applications. So in Amadeus, we love Angular. It's our framework of choice, our default platform on which we build. But more importantly, we've got this very unique setup where we are not only using Angular, but we are collaborating with the Angular team at Google and actually push the code to the framework. So we had this collaboration going on for years, but the net effect of it is that I can spend the vast majority of my time actually working with the Angular team and push code, work on the designs and so on and so forth. And I think I would like to take this opportunity to kind of shout out to Amadeus and Angular teams that to thanks for this collaboration being possible. I'm just so proud that there are setups possible where companies using open source can kind of give back to the community. So one of the effects of this collaboration is the recent RFC that we published around a month ago. It's called Standalone Components, Directives, and Pipes, or other title that circulates in the community is probably making NGModules optional. And I want to walk you through this RFC, how it came about, why we decided to go in this direction. How does it look like in terms of code, how you would interact with the new APIs? And also discuss a bit about what this move opens up, right? Because this is the series of moves. We see this RFC as just one potential step that opens up another possibilities. So yeah, let's start with some context, or actually talking about the problem we are trying to address in the Angular framework. And to talk about the framework, like the problems or like potential solutions, I want us to look a bit into the details or inner workings of Angular, like how it actually does its magic. And more specifically, I would like to a bit ponder with you what happens when you write my-component in your template, and how the framework, Angular or any other framework really, figures out that this my-component tag actually corresponds to a my-component class, right? Like the framework needs to have some way of knowing that if I written my-component tag, it needs to find this class that I wrote. It needs to create an instance of this class. It needs to kind of link the two things, like execute all the lifecycle hooks or like host bindings and whatnot. And obviously, just looking at the slide, you probably figured out that the connection is being made through this selector property on the Angular add component annotation. But the whole story is much more complex than this, right? Because we've got a selector that matches the name of a tag. But the question is, how should I find this class with a selector, right? If I've got a potentially huge application consisting of, I don't know, thousands of components, and I see this my-component tag, how I'm finding the right class? Should I iterate through all possible classes in the entire application and match all the selectors? Well, that potentially could be very slow, right? Like because the application might have like many components. So there is something more needed, which is basically an ability to express what are the components that can even match in a template. And in Angular, this mechanism to restricting available components or just kind of specifying a set of what can potentially be active in a template is this construct called NGModule. So NGModule has multiple roles, and I will talk about it in more details. But one of those roles is just what I was trying to describe, is just like, hey, saying here is the set of components, directives, and pipes that can be active in your Angular template. But when if you work with Angular or use the NGModule, you know that there are like at least two ways of specifying the available components, directives, and pipes in a template. So on one hand, we've got this field called declarations, which we can think of as the bag or like collection of things, right? Like, so you can throw into this collection different components, directives, and pipes, and then will be available in a template. But more importantly, when you throw those things into this one bin, those things can see each other by putting things into declarations of NGModule. We are creating a group of friends, and they collaborate with one another. They can see one another. And what I'm saying they can see one another is just they can collaborate on one element, or they can inject one another. Just basically do anything given the common visibility. So this is one way of specifying what is possible in a template. But NGModule has this other field, which is called imports. And imports field is just ability to also bring other groups of friends, saying like, hey, like I'm forming this one group, but like it would be also nice to collaborate with other groups, right? So we got this ability to create bins of collaborating directives, but also connecting those collections together. So if you look at this picture, there are quite a bit of arrows, right? Like there are those different rules for the visibility, because in declarations, everyone can see each other. With imports, it's kind of slightly different because that's an arrow in one direction. So what we've noticed over the years is that all those rules for NGModule, like how things behave in declarations, how things behave in imports, they can be a little bit confusing, especially for the new Angular developers. And even more so is that like an NGModule is such a central concept in Angular that you have to learn it right from the start. Like it's impossible to learn Angular without touching upon NGModules. On top of this, we are using words like declarations and imports and exports. And obviously we've got the same concepts in JavaScript or TypeScript. So another observation is that, especially from people that do trainings or documentation and so on. So the other observation was that it starts to be a bit confusing. Like, what is the import in JavaScript and NGModule? Like, why do I have to have two and so on? So yeah, like we've got this concept. It serves a role. Once again, we've got NGModule among other things to specify a set of potentially available components that in pipes. But again, this is Angular specific concept, and it doesn't come without its problems. So just to sum up what I was describing so far, when Angular encounters my-component tag in a template, it actually needs to match a class to activate a component class or create an instance on this tag. It actually needs to go through the two steps. One is, what is the potential set of classes that I need to look at? And when this set is determined, then Angular will iterate through each class in this set and will check CSS selector on each class, like, oh, do you match this element, or and so on. But that's not the end of the story. And in reality, the NGModule story is more complex than this. So we talked about this declaration and how we are friends in declarations and everyone sees each other. We talked about like how you can make groups collaborate. But also Angular has this concept of dependency injection, and the NGModule has this field called providers, right? Like, which means that you can specify dependency injection services. And one thing to notice here is that as soon as you specify a service in the providers field, those services are injectable into every component directly for pipe that goes declared on the same module, which means that putting a component directly on pipe in NGModule declarations has so many consequences, right? Like, on one hand, we are specifying what is available in a template. We are determining the visibility rules between different declared components. But we also kind of specify what type of dependency injection services are available for those component directives in pipe. So there are lots of arrows. That's the kind of the basic message here, that there's just lots of arrows in the system. And the story is not over with NGModules, right? Like, this is we are just kind of going step by step. So what I mean by this is, here you can see the API documentation for @NGModule annotation, and you can see all the different fields. So I absolutely don't expect anyone to read through this slide, but I just wanted to say that there are many fields on NGModule, and there are many fields on this NGModule because this mental construct or this API plays many different roles. So we talked about the declarations and imports and exports, so to determine what is visible in a template. We talked about providers and dependency injections. But there are more things you can specify on NGModule. On NGModule, what is the component to Bootstrap? There is some compiler configuration. There are some fields that we deprecated along the years, right? Like, so this is kind of loaded concept. And again, this concept is there right from the beginning when you're learning Angular. you have to learn about NGModule. So the net effect of this whole setup or this mental model is that in Angular, like you write components, you write directives, you write pipes, but you have to package them or wrap them into an NGModule. And it's very hard to take a component, directive, or pipe in isolation. You cannot pull them out of NGModule, because if you do this, you lose all the context, right? Like if you put a component directive pipe in declarations, you created friends with other collaborating directives. You created an arrow to dependency injection services that are available for this component. So as soon as anyone tries, and people tried, as soon as someone tries to kind of grab a component directive pipe, like in isolation, for example, saying, I will lazy load a component and instantiate it without loading the associated NGModule, then the things fail miserably during the runtime because we've lost all the associated context. So that's why in the team, we are saying that NGModule is the smallest unit of reuse in Angular, and really to think about lazy loading or packaging your application, you have to think about NGModules. And again, this is the concept that is there right from the beginning of the learning journey. It has multiple responsibilities, so it might get confusing. So really for years, we've been trying to think about the different mental model, about the different setup, about the different set of APIs where NGModules would not be necessary as part of the, like working with Angular on the daily basis. And this is all the recent RFC is about. It's about creating different set of APIs where you can write Angular applications without NGModules. This is not to say that we are deleting NGModules or that we are doing like breaking changes or that we are totally shifting the architecture of Angular application. No, it's more like saying we want to enable different ways of writing applications where you don't have to encounter NGModules. So again, I've mentioned that we had this this project on our mind, or this idea of module-less Angular for years. But interestingly, we had different tries. Like if you follow GitHub pull requests, you might have seen at least 2 or 3 different PRs that were already trying to get rid of NGModules. But every time we were trying, there was something missing, or like some scenarios were complicated. And only when we sat down and started to talk about like what we really want to achieve, the kind of pieces fall into the place. So those are the goals. Like this actually were discussed a lot in the Angular team, and we finally came up with something saying like, hey, we want to make NGModules optional. We want to move slowly towards a mental model where component directives and pipes are playing more central role. Again, making NGModules optional doesn't mean that we want to remove them, at least not at the beginning, right? Like so nothing is going away. We are not applying any non-backward compatible changes here. But at the same time, our hope is that as soon as NGModules become optional, it will significantly improve application developer experience, because many of the user journeys or developer journeys will not involve NGModule. Like there will be one less thing to learn. There will be one less API to call. So it should reduce the boilerplate code. But at the same time, the value of Angular is so much into its entire ecosystem. So there are like thousands and thousands of libraries published to NPM. They all wrapped in NGModules. So we don't want to say like, hey, now NGModules are optional and now like all the libraries should go and change. No, one of the stated goals is that we want to preserve the entire ecosystem, which means that existing NGModules, existing libraries published to NPM should work as is without any intervention on the library author side. So I will show you examples of this interoperability that we've got on our mind, but that's the stated goal. And obviously, we don't want to degrade performance. Like the hope is that actually some things will get faster, especially on the compilation side, because all of a sudden the compiler will have less work. Okay, so with this like very, very long introductions, let's go to the actual RFC. And I've spent so much time on introductions because the actual proposal, I believe it's very simple and can be summarized on one slide. So this is just this one slide that summarizes the whole proposal. And all the other code examples that I will be showing in a minute are just stem from this like principle that we are going to discuss here. So on this slide, you can see a typical Angular component. It uses the forms module, it uses the NGModule directive, and like I'm just typing something in a form and the name appears. Nothing special here for Angular developers. Again, since it's an Angular component, it needs to come with its associated NGModule. So at the bottom of the slide, you can see how I need to declare this component. I need to import it. I need to import like all its dependencies. So in this case, a forms module, and I can potentially export the component in question if I want it to be usable in the outside world. And interestingly, over the years, Angular community came with different patterns of ways of structuring this interplay between component and NGModule. So if you think about two extremes, some people would say, I will have just one NGModule class for entire applications, and I will bring all the components in there. Some people went to completely different extreme and say, I will have an NGModule for each and every component in my application, right? Like, so as here on this slide. So the proposal in the RFC is to kind of bring this pattern on the framework level. So what we are going to do, or at least what is proposed in the RFC, is that we are going to add a field called standalone true. And this mentally means that this component is on its own. It cannot be declared in any NGModule. It does not need or can take advantage of any context of NGModule. So you can think about it as a component that is wrapped in its own module, like it stands alone. It doesn't collaborate with others, and it kind of comes with its own wrapping module. So you can think about it as just like adding the standalone true means like, oh, I'm self-declared. I'm not part of any other NGModule. But obviously, as soon as we say I'm standalone, I don't need any other context, I'm not collaborating with anyone. The question is like how a component specifies a set of components and directives that ought to be available in the template. So in our proposal, it's saying you can add imports field on an add component level and specify template dependencies very close to where those dependencies are used. Okay. And essentially, that is it. The whole RFC is it. Just saying, I'm going to mark components, directives, and pipes as standalone, which means that they are not declarable in NGModules. They are like staying apart. They are cutting ties to everything that NGModule can bring. So they are not friends with anyone. They are not using any dependency injection providers. They're just standing alone. The other piece of the puzzle is, okay, since I'm standing alone, I cut ties to NGModule. I cannot specify my friends. So how I'm specifying my dependencies? Well, that's the imports fields, which is here. And all the other code examples that I'm going to show are really just following from this. That's the whole RFC in one slide. Now, if you are a more visual person and like just don't prefer to see diagrams than code examples, I would summarize the RFC like moving from this word, like this, like lots of arrows word, to another word where we've got another mental model where there are just standalone components and they can reference other standalone components. Again, if you want to switch from diagrams to the code, that's a code example where a standalone component is referencing another standalone component. It's kind of importing it and thus making it available in its template. So I'm saying, hey, I want to bring the class. I'm saying that I will be using it in a template, and I'm using it in a template. Some people, when going through the RFC, they were giving us feedback that they are a bit afraid that this imports field might get very long or very big, because if my template needs a lot of dependencies, then listing them one by one might be a bit cumbersome. But what we need to notice or need to know that the imports field at component works along the same line, so like with the same rules at the imports fields of NGModule, which means that you can create your own mini collection of directives or components as a simple array, right? Like a static array, and then you can import it again just using JavaScript constructs. You can bring it into close to the template, and obviously then I'm sorry, use it in the template. So you can think about it as replacing NGModule grouping facilities and imports and exports with pure JavaScript constructs. So we want to get to this world where we are just closer to the JavaScript, right? Like you can capitalize on what you already know from TypeScript or JavaScript. So again, switching, if you're a more visual person, you can import things. And what I wanted to highlight is that something I was like trying to be very explicit about is that we won't preserve backward compatibility or interoperability with the existing world, which means that on one hand, we discuss how a standalone component can depend or import different component. But again, there's so much code on NPM. There are so many of the existing NGModules. So how would you use those existing NGModules in the standalone component? Well, you can actually import them into the imports fields at that component, right? So this is this very important feature of the proposal where I can work in the new world where NGModules are not the thing, but at the same time, I want to take advantage of the existing ecosystem. That's why it's possible to import existing NGModules. That's obviously can be mixed and matched, which means that the imports fields at component can contain other standalone components or NGModules. The other aspect of interoperability is that you might, as the library author, you can commit to this new world, say like, okay, I can see that I can write my components directly in pipes in the standalone way. I don't need NGModules to write it, but still many of the applications out there might be saying, hey, but I like NGModules. I want to use them. I see the value in them. And that's all right. So we're giving this ability to libraries to author standalone directives components and pipes, but still publish an interoperability NGModule where you would re-export standalone components directives and pipes, right? So a lot of effort in this proposal went into making sure that we are introducing a new ways of doing things where you don't have to see NGModule. We're creating those standalone things, but on one hand, you can import NGModule to take advantage of the existing ecosystem. But on the other hand, NGModules are also like the applications that still prefer to use NGModule. There is a way of continuing on this path. And we mostly do this because we want to see how this ecosystem evolves, like how people adapt to this different way of doing things. So while we've got our perfect idea of like how Angular could look like in the years to come, we want to keep all the doors open and see what works in practice. So this was this kind of bird's eye view of the RFC, what we are planning to, or like what gets designed and what we are planning to implement in the first shot. Obviously, RFC goes into much more details. There are much more code examples, so I will have a reference to the document in a sec. But besides of like those details and like the standalone field and what you can import and when, I think it's really that this proposal is profoundly changing how we are going to think about Angular. And part of it is that we can see a world where you can start writing applications without encountering NGModule at all. So I've got two more examples of APIs that are not fully fleshed out. There are still like many details to be, or maybe not many, but there are details to figure out. But I still want to show those code examples because they will give you a glimpse of what might be coming in the future. So I've mentioned lazy loading scenarios of components in the past, and I was saying that that kind of today it's not really possible, because if you grab a component and lazy load it in isolation, you cut all the ties to the NGModule context. So potentially some providers will not be available and your component will fail at runtime, or maybe the NGModule had two collaborating directives and like they will be missing when you load the component, right? Like so just lazy loading a component today is dangerous because you might cut ties to the important context. But standalone components don't have this problem at all. They are self-contained, that explicitly list the dependencies. So they are really standing alone. I can grab them and lazy load them. So we've been doing some API specifications in version 13 of Angular. And alongside with those simplifications and standalone components, it will be possible to grab view container ref as you would do today, use regular JavaScript dynamic imports and say, I want to load the class representing a component and insert it into the container. That's all, like no associated NGModule, no dangers of breaking things at runtime. Another API that I wanted to show, and again, this is not fully designed yet, so like don't quote me on this, but like if we would introduce something like Bootstrap Component, you could write entire like minimal Angular application would look like shown on this slide, right? Like today, to create even the simplest hello world application, you have to create an NGModule. You have to bootstrap NGModule. If we go to standalone components, they've got all the context they need, which means I can grab them and bootstrap them the same way as I can lazy load components. What you see on this slide is just complete Angular application, which again, for people familiar with the current setup, you can probably appreciate that it's much shorter. But again, it's not only about being shorter, it's most importantly about lowering the number of concepts that you have to learn when starting with Angular. Cool. So that's it. Like just to sum up what we've been discussing so far, NG modules are part of the Angular applications today, but we are hoping to make them optional. It doesn't mean removing them. We want to keep backward compatibility. We're thinking a lot about interoperability with the existing ecosystem. But we want to slowly move into the world where component directives and pipe are the first-class citizen, where you have APIs to actually work more on the component level rather than on NGModule level. Obviously, this is such a fundamental change to the framework that we are taking it slowly. That's why there is an RFC out there. It's not too late to participate in the discussion. There is already lots of comments and lots of interesting feedback. And again, we are here in this for the long term. So if this RFC is adopted, and I certainly hope so, then we will keep implementing it, adopting the APIs and guides and so on, and kind of moving the whole ecosystem to this new mental model. If you feel like digging into this more, there is a link to the RFC. It's a discussion on GitHub. But I also wanted to mention that I don't know if I can open it here. Let me try. I hope I will not break anything. But we also created a stack blitz where we just hacked the implementation together, right? Like it's not production implementation. Just please don't use it. But you actually can play with those APIs. Just actually write standalone through and get the feeling for it, right? So there is a way of experimenting with this proposal even before it's fully implemented. And so it's completely hackish. What is in the Slack is completely hackish. Again, don't use it in production, but you can experiment and get the feel of this API. Whoop. And I think I just closed my slides by accident, but that's all right because that was my last slide. And I think we've got enough time to talk about if any of this leaves some like details that I didn't answer, then we can discuss it. I'm trying to bring the last slide. Yep, that's it on my side.
Thank you very much, Pavel. I shared the link to the RFC on the chat for this track. So if you want to know more, please click the link I left on Umbrella. So I also want to ask if any one of you have questions for Pavel, please leave them on Umbrella and I will ask those questions to Pavel. So I have a comment for you more than a question, Pavel, which is, I think it's definitively interesting seeing that Angular is trying to lower the learning curve, because that's one of the comments I heard the most from people going directly to React or Vue or whatever, which is the learning curve is a lot lower. It's easier to get into and start doing something. So yes, you may be losing some clientele because of that. So yes, I'm happy to see, because we start at the company, we start with the AngularJS in version 0.9, something like that. It was also the one we liked the most back in then, and then with Angular 2 we still was in love with Angular 2, but the trend we see with our client is going to a different direction. So yes,
Yeah, no,
kudos,
absolutely. I
kudos to you.
understand. I understand
Yeah,
this,
yeah,
and again, like it's so. Actually, like I think like I'm speaking for myself, but like I believe that's the like all the Angular team members would say. Like we don't see those things as competition, right? Like we're actually happy to see the JavaScript ecosystem grow, and like there are more ideas from out there, and we can see how other people experiments are playing out, right? Like I think Angular like introduced many new concepts to the table. Now other frameworks are like introducing new concepts. And I believe that that's all right. That's great, actually, because like maybe there will be next generation framework that will be even better.
yeah. In the end, what is important is this some kind of competition will make things better for developers and for the job, because
Absolutely.
they will improve themselves. They will learn from each other, and in the end, you have better frameworks, better tools.
Absolutely. And the another so yeah, I just like in terms of I think goals and aspirations, we absolutely want to just move the web development space forward, and like we absolutely want to learn from others. We're happy when others are learning based on the paths we followed. The other interesting play here is just evolving the ecosystem of this magnitude, right? Like there are just I've mentioned there are so many packages published on npm, and there's so much value, the like widget libraries and utilities and whatnot. But there's also so much other things which form the ecosystem. So all the learning materials, all the blog posts, all the books that we've written, all the trainings and so on. Like, so if we do the change that is non-backward compatible, we will be breaking this. But there's another aspect of it. There is all the mental models, like how people kind of learn to do things in one way. So if you do a shift, which is very radical, then you break in potentially some of those natural pathways in developer workflow.
Yeah.
So it's very delicate balance, right? Like
Yeah.
I think
because if you never break backwards compatibility, in the end, some years, some versions from now, you may have a monster that is really too big because you don't want to leave anything behind. Yeah, it's too heavy, it's too big, and yeah, you will still see people moving away because of that. So yeah, it's as you say, is a very tricky. It's very tricky.
it is balancing act.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I think we also did a lot of changes. We always had a compiler sitting on top of your like components and templates, which means that we can do a lot of transformations. So what gets published into npm is still going through the Angular compiler, which means that we can do some transformations for you. So I think that's advantage. But also we, when designing like support for libraries on IB, we specifically wanted to make sure that we can do big moves in the future, that we don't publish generated code to npm that would just freeze us forever. Mm-hmm. So we've got lots of ambitions. We've got like, I think I mean, I wish I would like could like share all the things we are discussing internally, but there is a big ecosystem. There is a big ecosystem.
And let me invite anyone that wants to continue to this discussion to reach you on Twitter, and even after the event, I think they can still have this discussion with you.
Absolutely.
And maybe help on this new architecture. So before we run out of time, we have two questions on the Brella chat. Let me read them. Mm-hmm. One is from Renato Nunes. I didn't read the RFC yet, and I'm seeing advantage in the learning curve for the new ones on Angular, but there is more benefits of using standalone components instead of NGModule declarations for components. Are there still more benefits?
Yeah, right. Like so obviously we talked about the learning curve, and like more importantly, like the more concepts you've got, the more things there are to learn, the more APIs and so on. The other benefits is that like we hear this quite a lot, is that Maybe let me start by saying that it will help compiler, right? Because today, when a compiler sees a template and just tags in the template my dash component, it just like literally doesn't know where the class for this component might be. So it needs to go figure like, oh, what are the NGModules that are associated with my template? What are the things that got imported into this NGModule and so on and so on. It's extremely complicated process in terms of like computations. And people at Google are like, fantastic at like solving those hard problems, but it's still a hard problem. So by moving imports to add component, you're kind of giving imports graph to a component. So a compiler has like all of a sudden much easier job, because it just like start, oh, those are my imports, those are the imports of my imports, this is the graph, I know what's being activated. So this is the benefit for the compiler, and it should speed up the compilation. Interesting thing is that what we keep hearing is that it's good for compilers, but it's also good for humans, because you see very closely close to a template what is being used in this template. Like you kind of, I was saying that there is those two layers of interaction between writing a tag in the template and your class. This is the NGModule and CSS class. So we're kind of collapsing one of those layers.
Yeah, very, very important that for me.
Right. And then there is obviously all those benefits for other APIs that we can just, hide NGModule.
Okay, thank you. So we have 3 minutes left. We have another question from Andre Souza. How we remove unused components? That is dead code, because it looks the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, so the compiler does that today. Like, so even if you've got something in your NGModule and it's not used in a template, it will not be included in your generated code. And so compiler is smart enough today to do this, and it will be as smart with standalone components. So like the fact that you import something and don't use will not kind of penalize you in terms of your application code size. The other thing to mention here is that we've got this thing called like language service. When your IDE, you will see, probably you will be able to highlight like, oh, hey, this stuff is unused. So even if it doesn't harm your generated code size, you will still probably see it like, oh, it's like unused import in JavaScript, right? Like if you package your things like rollup and so on, that like they will eliminate that code. It's the same rules apply here.
Okay, thank you very much, Pawel. I think we don't have any more questions, and we are running out of time. So let me wrap up by saying thank you very much, Pawel. It was an amazing talk, and I hope next year we can meet in person in Porto City, Portugal.
Absolutely, this would be fantastic. Thanks for having me, and like I would love to visit Portugal. Never been here. And
yeah, you need to come. You will love it.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.